David Shumate is the author of High Watermark, winner of the 2003 Agnes Lynch Starrett Poetry Prize, and has authored 3 more books of poetry. His poetry has appeared widely in literary journals and has been anthologized in Good Poems for Hard Times, The Best American Poetry, and The Writer's Almanac. Shumate is poet in residence at Marian University and lives in Zionsville, Indiana. Today, David and I talk about the elemental essence that gardening, cooking, contemplation, and poetry share. We talk about what it means to follow the brush, culturing of wisdom as the heart of the arts, and so much more. David also reads a few of his poems, including one of my all-time favorites, Teaching a Child the Art of Confession. You can visit contemplify.com for the show notes on this episode and sign up for the monthly Contemplify non-required reading list. Now, join me in raising a glass to my guest, David Shumate.
This is the title poem from my first collection of prose poems entitled High Watermark. It's hard to believe, but at one point the water rose to this level. No one had seen anything like it. People on rooftops, cows and coffins floating through the streets, prisoners carrying invalids from their rooms, the barkeeper consoling the preacher, a coonhound who showed up a month later 40 miles downstream, and all that mud it left behind. You never forget times like those. They become part of who you are. You describe them to your grandchildren, but they think it's just another tale in which animals talk and people live forever. I know it's not the kind of thing you ought to say, but I wouldn't mind seeing another good flood before I die. It's been dry for decades. Next time, I think I'll just let go and drift downstream and see where I end up.
Thank you, Dave, so much for kicking off our time together with that poem, High Watermark. As you read that poem today and the years that have passed since you first penned it, how does it strike you in 2023 and all the years that have passed? How is that poem speaking back to you at this season of your life?
I think, there are some poems that feel they capture a time and a place, and then later that has expired, that time frame has expired. But this poem and many that I have written, I hope have a greater sense of universality to them, timelessness to them. This poem was actually born from just a fragment of what I remember in a conversation, which is where so many poems for me begin. Fleeting memory returns, a catchphrase from 30 years ago, and suddenly it takes on a new life. One thing I always tell students, I'm retired now, but when I taught before, was that everything is important, that pay attention, that you may not think that this fragment from your experience right now has significance, but be mindful of it, because as time passes, it may find its way seeping back into your awareness, which is what is true with this poem. I remember walking along near the Mississippi River with my cousin Kathy, who lived in Hannibal, Missouri, where quite a number of my relatives came from. And in those days, the flood control there was not very good, and the town would flood somewhat regularly. And this time, a flood really did come up to the first, past the first floor ceiling into the second floor.
Wow.
And so this poem starts with only that, with that idea. And as is true with so many of my poems, from that point of inspiration, it mutates into a reality of its own. And suddenly here it is so large that cows and coffins are floating through the streets, which happens in some towns, actually. I do remember floods in New Orleans that people are buried above ground there in tombs, and that some broke loose. And so that comes into play in this poem as well. And so this poem arises partly from lived experience and partly from the equally valid experience of the imagination.
I'm so struck by that sense of it, that a seed gets planted in a conversation where it could be a line or a phrase or a memory or a story, and then it begins to live a life on the imaginal plane where it starts to take off in other directions. Have you been surprised by the seed of a conversation or like the seed of a line that, say, like this particular poem where it starts one place and then ends up somewhere else? Is there any poems that jump to mind that you're like, okay, the seed of this was this humorous thing or this conversational bit, but where it took was a totally different tone or totally different experience for the writing itself?
Every time, almost every time, because if I sit with, sometimes a fragment like this comes to me, but usually when I begin a writing session, I'm simply there, meaning here in this chair, in this room, open and receptive to what might come my way. I seldom sit down and plan a poem. And if I am not surprised by where a poem takes me, I'm disappointed. Because if I knew the entire trajectory of the poem before I started, there would be no joy in writing the poem. Here's a thing that I would add at this point, and this kind of drifts into the metaphysical a little, but I think it's appropriate. And that is that the session, a poetry session for me, is on one hand set to sponsor the arrival and birth and refinement of a poem. But for me, the poem is more the byproduct of that session. And when everything is working well, when all the cylinders are firing, there is a kind of synchrony that takes place, synchrony of awareness. By that, I mean, in that quiet state where the poem finds its way into my awareness, if I'm working well, the mind, the intellect, the senses, the ego, the spirit, all work in such synchrony that it can give rise to a wholeness, a sense of wholeness of being. That is where the true poem takes place, inside. And what is on the page is the pleasant byproduct of that experience. Now, I'm talking about writing at its highest level for me. It's not always that way. It can also be frustrating all the way. But in terms of the surprise, the poem surprising me, that surprise comes from that momentary or prolonged sense of synchrony. That is what brings a poet back to the writing of a poem again and again and again. What's on the page is nice, that's fine, others will enjoy it and maybe benefit from that sense of synchrony. But the truest and deepest value is allowing the faculties of the being to unite in sponsorship of that poem. You will hear musicians, you will hear artists, all will talk about the ability of the art to transport the artist.
Yes.
And so we come back to the writing desk again and again. That's
such a beautiful, evocative expression of what occurs and what happens in what I would consider the spiritual practice of writing poetry. Yes. And I love how, as a reader, I share in that from a completely different angle. But yes. It's the same ground. And I read an interview that you gave somewhere where you also talked about it as it's like a seductive feeling. And I've been drawn to the way that, seduction is often used in popular lingo in one particular way when it refers to sex. But I think being seduced by the muse, by God, by mystery, to kind of a sense of vocation, a vocational call to do what is yours to do. And I feel like you've just captured that in this beautiful container of what that experience is like for you when you are in that space, and what flows out of that, and how you're less, at least how I'm hearing it, you're less concerned about the outcome than the experience and process of itself. Yeah.
Well, the hope and the experience is that by doing this again and again, that sense of synchrony comes easier over time. If, however, you find yourself, as I have in this last week, estranged from the process, where other things draw you away and you're not able to allow yourself to participate in that experience each day, I miss 3 days and I return and say, now what do I do? It feels foreign. It feels foreign. And so, yes, the experience is hopefully a kind of, I'll go with the word seduction, an experience that draws you into itself. But ultimately, I think in poetry, as with music and as with art, what is the seducer is the seductress as well. You are ultimately being drawn into your deeper self. I wish I had this quote with me today. I believe it's Ralph Waldo Emerson, Granddaddy Walt, who I think it was in one of his essays, the essay on the poet, and he talks about what all great people know and great artists know, and in this case he was talking about poets, is that, and I won't try to capture his words, but that within their own limited sphere, their power is limited. But they know that they have recourse to a much greater sphere. And by opening that up, their words become thunder, is one of the expressions that he used. And I find, 150 years ago, he's writing that, and this is what poets and artists and musicians and so on experience all the time. I guess an athlete calls it coming into the zone or something, into that space where the small person becomes a larger person, like Emerson says in his essay, The Poet.
I'm a big Emerson fan, and it makes me want to revisit that essay.
Yes, yeah.
The language it uses it touches on the spiritual, philosophical, and religious, and how you are forming language in such a way that it touches those deepest recesses of our deeper selves.
Yes.
What traditions have nourished you, whether it's philosophical, religious, literary, spiritual? I'm sure there's many, I'm sure, but if there's just a few that kind of rise to the top at this moment that you feel like you're most gleaning from.
I was raised in Kansas as a Methodist and didn't feel particularly drawn to that tradition, but I did later, in my late teens, find myself interested in spirituality in the larger sense. I was definitely drawn to Hinduism, to meditation, to Buddhism, but setting aside the formal traditions of each of those, I was drawn to the essence that they all spoke about. And I found that same acknowledgement of the depth of the human spirit in poetry. Juan Ramon Jimenez, the Spanish poet of the mid-20th century, writes so eloquently and so concisely about the same things that I would read about in Hinduism and in Buddhism. And so that likeness, that shared sense of access to the universal, nourished me. I found it in all kinds of poetry. William Stafford's work has always been a deep inspiration for me. The work of the Chinese poets of the Tang Dynasty, their simplicity, their reverence for ordinary life, all spoke to that same core in me, and in many others. I'm maybe not surprised, but interested to hear how many other poets cite the Chinese poets of the Tang Dynasty, and really Chinese poets in general, antiquity, as being inspirations. And I think it's largely because of that clear, concise language and poetry that strives to find the essence of things. And that's what art should be doing in its highest form, I think. Not only discovering that, but allowing readers and listeners and viewers to access that in some way. It's part of the job of the artist, I think.
Yeah. I'm just sitting in deep appreciation for the way that I feel like the questions that I'm asking, you're your answers and responses are expounding them beyond
Mm.
the what I'm asking, which is such a gift for me to hear the ways that you ride those waves to deeper parts of the ocean. I know that you were teaching writing, and I also read that you like to garden and to cook. And I see these as all creative acts, all parts relational. And I'm wondering, how do you see those as parallel paths to writing poetry?
Mm. Good question. Thank you for that. Just a moment ago, I used the word elemental, and I I think that is what those share. Um, Gardening is essentially taking that which is elemental and giving it a new sense of order, an individual sense of order, where a new kind of beauty might be experienced. And it's a public kind of piece, gardening. Right now, the tulips are up in the garden, and it looks quite nice this morning. Um, uh, with cooking, I think it's the same thing. That here we have spread out on the counter all of these elements, and together they have this interesting value. But when combined in a unique, creative way that is sponsored by the desire for enrichment, physical and spiritual, they take on a whole different feel. And that is the same with poetry, with writing, with musicians as well. You take these notes and you put them in this order, and wow, I never thought of that before. Or wow, I never tasted that before. Or I never saw plants in such synchrony before. Um, they're, so I think they share that ability to take the normal, everyday, elemental and place them in a configuration that is perhaps unexpected, but most importantly, nourishing. Nourishing to the body and to the spirit.
I'm struck by as I think about each of those, what I would, you could call a contemplative practice or even discipline that is elemental and also expressive, that there's this through line of paying attention to really craft those disciplines. Do you consider gardening, cooking, teaching, writing all to be contemplative practices in that way? This is kind of the through line of so much of what draws this podcast, Contemplify, is kind of a contemplative perspective. And I'm curious if that rings true for you in that elemental, poetic vibration of a lived life with this discipline of paying attention.
Yes, I think that is definitely true. You don't compose anything if you aren't in tune already with the objects you're working with. You have to have paid attention, and beyond that, been open and receptive to those elements that you're dealing with. I would draw a distinct line between paying attention and concentrating or something. For me, paying, and I know you are too, paying attention is more than listening, more than watching. Paying attention is being open to the possibilities, to the experience. Too often, paying attention might become associated with a hyper alertness that for me does not work.
Right.
That's for me, that's not what, and so contemplation certainly is moving in that direction, but paying attention and openness. I like the idea of the way paying attention suggests a grander openness, because that openness, that receptivity, diminishes the importance of the listener and enhances the importance of the object listened to. Because if we are open, we are our expectations are limited. We are receptive to all, and in that sense of receptivity, beauty can arise. We can acknowledge the essence of the thing that we are open to. Here's a thing that this leads to a phrase I used to use a lot when I taught, and my students may have become weary of it over time. It's a Chinese expression as well, borrowed. Where did this? Michael Ondaatje, I think I heard say at one time, that a Canadian novelist and Sri Lankan novelist, but he talked about the Chinese expression of following the brush. And this was a painter's expression. And I like it so much because it diminishes the role of the individual artist and further validates the role of the larger intuition, the spiritual element maybe, where if we are open and receptive in a writing session, we also must be willing to follow that inspiration we talked about in this poem. At one point, the water rose to this level. No one had seen anything like it, the high watermark poem. And so in a state of openness and with a willingness to, quote, follow the brush, I found myself, now 35 years ago or so, in that poem, following it to places I did not expect to go. And respecting the fact that the intellect may be, in many cases, the poet's worst tool. That the intellect is great in very many instances in the crafting and revising of a poem, but in the imagining of the poem, it takes a far back seat to the intuition, to the element of the person that sniffs through what might result of this poem, that, in the Chinese phrase, follows the brush, because the poem has a sense of unfolding on its own. And the wise poet says, I'll get out of the way. Donald Hall had a very fine poem called The Master, which talks very much about that, about the need to get out of the way of the poem. And so those are some of the principles that sponsor my writing.
It's wonderful to hear those. And, some things you said reminded me of some of my own contemplative teachers who talk about objectless awareness, or ways of getting out of the way so that you can actually perceive from a cleaner lens because you're not trying to force something there, or there's an agendaless agenda. And the way in which you are speaking to that and showing up in that form, I think is, it just continues to kind of harmonize with some of my own intuitions about the overlaps of the arts and spirituality, particularly in kind of contemplative streams of philosophical and religious traditions.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind reading the poem. This is one of my favorites, Teaching a Child the Art of Confession.
Mm. I do have that marked here somewhere. Yes. I'll read it and then maybe talk some about
That'd be great.
Inspiration as it came along. Teaching a child the art of confession. It's best not to begin with Adam and Eve. Original sin is baffling, even for the most sophisticated minds. Besides, children are frightened of naked people and apples. Instead, start with the talking snake. Children like to hear what animals have to say. Let him hiss for a while and tell his own tale. They'll figure him out in the end. Describe sin simply as those acts which cause suffering, and leave it at that. Steer clear of musty confessionals. Children associate them with outhouses. Leave hell out of the discussion. They'll be able to describe it on their own soon enough. If they feel the need to apologize for some transgression, tell them that one of the offices of the moon is to forgive. As for the priest, let him slumber a while more.
Thank you, Dave. I love that poem.
Oh, thank you. Again, this poem took me where I did not expect it to travel, but that was enriching ultimately to me. This is a poem from early days. I remember talking to a friend and several friends who talked about, as children, they were Catholics, raised as Catholics, and as children, how they feared confession and how they didn't know what to say. They did not know what was expected of them in terms of talking to some stranger in a small booth about what they might have done wrong and how they might be forgiven. This poem also arose from the time when the very horrid abuses of that clergy were coming to light. I've had numerous friends who, as children, were victims of that and have spoken openly about it. And so this poem came from a mixture of those things, but it's also characterized, I think, by the way humor seeps into it as well. And I do find myself frequently finding humor and tragedy interweaving in a poem that sets me, and I think the reader also, a little off balance. I don't know whether to laugh or cry here, and at times. Maybe those are extremes of it, but what emotion is the most valid emotion to express here? Because there's an underlying sense of darkness in this poem, and a corresponding or an antithetical, perhaps, thread of humor, of levity, which is pretty much what we experience daily in life, isn't it?
Yeah, yes. And I do think this is why I'm so drawn to your poetry, is because it holds the seriousness, the tragedy of life, and does not separate that from the humor and the joy. It's each poem I feel takes me on a ride of holding all in my hands as I go from the first syllable to the last. And that is part of why I find your poetry to be so repeatable. Like I can go back to it over and over and over again, because
that's nice.
Depending on my own mood and context, I might be laughing my ass off, or I might bring tears to my eyes, but it's the same poem. There's enough for me to hold and to let the light refract, or let the shadows take center stage, that I can experience it in the daily doldrums of living.
Yes.
And I find that remarkable. And this particular poem, it reminded me of song lyrics by Greg Brown. It reminded me of my own religious experiences. It reminded me of not knowing how to speak about religious symbols to my children. I feel like it held so much of my life from childhood to adulthood. And I could find myself in it and also outside of it. And that, I just thank you for writing poetry like that can connect at that deep level and also carry me throughout days and weeks and years.
Oh, well, what a compliment. Thank you so very much. Again, I look back at some of these poems and I'm surprised myself. I've read this poem many times, so I'm deeply familiar with its rhythms and all, but even I come upon a line and I think even in reading it, what I thought when I wrote it, and that is, in that moment, where did that come from? And if you find yourself as a poet, as a musician, asking that question, you're in the right place. You're getting into the right place. I'll take a moment here to mention, I don't know the names of these folks, very kind folks, but for me, music and poetry blend together because of the music of words. And even though I choose not to use a formal form, I use the prose poem here, I'm very aware of the need for a musicality in both the words and images. And apparently two different composers were inspired by this book, High Watermark, and in one case by that poem itself, to write about a 12-minute piece. I forget, Water Rising or something like that. I think it was. You could, I'm sure it's on the net somewhere.
Yeah, I'll look it up.
I think the composer was from New York, from Syracuse or Ithaca or somewhere like that. And then early on, another composer for his thesis did a whole symphony entitled High Watermark.
No kidding.
And so that for me was quite interesting, because I think they recognized that same musicality that rides beneath the waves there, I think, that does not impose itself in the poem, but whose rhythms bring you along in, I hope, a more natural way.
I love hearing that. I cannot wait. I will look up for those musical pieces. And what a compliment to your work. Because the musicality of your work, I think, is so strong. And I wanted to ask you about prose poetry. One of my favorite poets, Jim Harrison, calls prose poetry the most difficult of poetic forms.
Yes,
and
yeah.
I know there's a great quote by William Stafford about that you gain something and lose something in prose poetry. You lose the spaciousness, but you gain the trust of the reader. I'm kind of probably butchering it.
Well, I remember he said that you cannot. He used this word. You cannot bamboozle the writer through line breaks, and I appreciated that. That you don't have that technique to employ. And Harrison, of course, wrote different suites of prose poems and all. And he did. He talked about it as being the most difficult of forms to employ. We never met, but we corresponded a lot in the days of these first few books, and he definitely acknowledged the validity of the form and acknowledged it so much that he employed it quite frequently.
I know he was a champion of your work and a big fan of what you were doing. I'm curious. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I was honored to have him acknowledge it and recognize it, because I held Jim Harrison and Bill Stafford and Robert Bly and people like that in quite high esteem, and to have that kind of acknowledgement from someone whose work you respect deeply was really quite an honor.
Yeah, that's beautiful. There's a generosity of spirit that you carry, and that I can see that you, as you feel the honor of Jim Harrison and others seeing your work and appreciating your work. How have you tried to pass that on to younger writers? As a teacher, as you saw young poets, young writers seeking to deepen their own craft, how would you encourage them to stay the course and to listen with that eye of deep attention?
Well, it's what I did kind of as a profession for many years, teaching writing in all kinds of realms. And I continue to, even now, to serve as a sounding board for friends, all younger friends, most younger friends, who are interested in poetry and who I've known over the years. Just 10 minutes before we started recording this, I had an email from a student she must have been from 25 years ago. And this is National Poetry Month, and one of her poems was selected here in Indiana as to represent National Poetry Month. Mm. And her note was simply, in addition to the link she sent to the poem, it was simply still writing, But I also find myself very frequently responding to and responding to former students' poems that I get in the mail, in the email all the time. And it's quite gratifying to see those students go on to publish work of their own, to publish books of their own, to gain recognition, and more than anything, the personal satisfaction of the daily practice and the product that produces. So, although I'm officially retired as a teacher, you never lose that role, do you?
Yes.
It's always with you.
That's fantastic. You have a lucky crop of students and alum there who I'm sure are continuing to glean from the lessons learned from years ago, but how they get recycled through as life teaches you. You refer back to those moments. It's an incredible gift.
I hope that they appreciate it. I know they do. But anyone who is taught for any length of time also recognizes that on one hand, it may seem like a generous act, but on the other hand, it's really quite a selfish act, because a good teacher knows that the teacher learns more than the student all along the way. And sometimes those lessons are subtle, sometimes they're overt, but the teacher, in its highest form, the teacher not only might be learning more about the particular project that's being worked on or this or that, but the learning there is a different kind of learning. It's a culturing of wisdom. And that comes, hopefully, with repeated practice of teaching, so that you grow as a teacher, as the student grows as a writer. You grow as a person, as the student grows as a person. There's that, I use this phrase intentionally, this culturing of wisdom is what's at the heart of art, really. And so it's nice to see students move on and do wonderful things, and they're not the only ones who benefit from it as well.
Yes. Well, amen to that. That line, the culturing of wisdom is the heart of art. That resonates deeply for me. And I know, like, my whole purpose of doing this podcast is because I'm curious and I want to talk to folks like you, artists, contemplative scholars, practitioners of all sorts, because it's such an opportunity for me to dive deep and hopefully acculture some wisdom along the way. Mm-hmm. If it benefits anybody else, which I know that it does, but I'm first and foremost being selfish because it juices me up. I get incredibly excited to have this opportunity to talk with you about your poetry and others who I've spoken with. It's the essence of life. I feel like to feel this journey continuing to unfold, and that sense of discovery of the muse, of the divine, of mystery, imbibing the moment with such riches. And I don't mean that just on the positive side of that sorrow, of that tragedy, that it's all there that I have to sift through and hold and often chew on, whether I want to or not. But it's all, if I do that with integrity and attention, it seems to benefit me, and it seems to be of service to others.
Yes, yes.
I would love to know, because I know that you are also, you write poetry, but that you also write fiction. Is that correct?
I do. Less so, and much more slowly as well.
Okay. What do you see as the parallel? Are there parallels in those writing processes? Are there differences? Is it a different space you have to show up in? How do you approach those different styles?
It seems to me, I remember talking with Todd Davis about this once years ago, and I said about the two things that it seems to me that fiction takes more from you and poetry gives more to you.
Oh, interesting.
Now, whether most novelists would not agree with me on that, perhaps, but the process that I've described here in writing poetry is a different, it's going to the core, the essence of things. And for me, working with fiction is, you must enter that same sphere, or a similar sphere anyway, but it requires by nature a greater lacing together of the various elements that you don't have to do so much in poetry. The poem stands alone. The chapter does not.
Mm.
And so the working with fiction or sustaining something over 300 pages, that for me, that's a more foreign task. And so I tend to write in short chapters and or shorter chapters, really. I'm now trying to lace together pieces of a novel that are true to the same spirit of writing that my poems are, but that has an individual sense all its own. I remember being at a writing conference where I was the poet in residence, and this was a conference based that had a strong element of mystery writers as well. And so there were some very prominent mystery writers there. And we were talking in the evening after the sessions were over. And I remember saying to one, we were talking about whether we got any work done on a session like this, when we're at a conference like that. And I said, I did a poem that might live, just last night. But I said to one of them, I said, it's probably difficult for you to do any writing here because you have to resurrect this whole world and re-enter it. And he said, no. He said, I know what's going to be on page 154 from the beginning.
No kidding.
I know which clue is going to be revealed at this time. So that's a different writing. And it's valid, but it's that is certainly much more regimented, pre-planned writing than the writing of novelists that I respect, really.
Yeah.
Who have said planning like that would be the death to a novel.
Right.
There are very different ways of approaching it. Some say you must have that, others say you don't. So I'm finding my way in the middle there.
I go back to that aphorism of following the brush, where it sounds like that particular writer was not following the brush. It had the plans laid out before them. I'm wondering, as we start to move to our end here, if you wouldn't mind reading The Funeral of the Moon, another poem that speaks to me.
I do have that marked somewhere. The Funeral of the Moon. They were all in attendance. The one-eyed giant, the African gods, even the fat lady showed up with her entourage of dwarves and their 100 violins. We gathered at the beach where other mourners had decorated the waves with flowers, the darkness with rain. A magpie delivered the eulogy. He spoke of the friend we had all lost, how she had so loved the sky, how night would never be the same. And love, without the moon, who could hope to love again? We bowed our heads and prayed. When it was time, the strong man lowered her into the grave, and the rivers wept openly. At the pub that night, we raised a glass to the deceased. We sang her favorite songs, told the stories she loved to tell, like in the old days when she was still around. Everyone, even the stars, agreed it was just the way she would have wanted it.
Thank you, Dave.
I read that, well, now it's been a couple years ago at the funeral of a distant cousin, a young woman who had died tragically. And it was, I guess, a poem that she liked very much, but it seemed apt for her as well. So it takes on a greater poignancy for me at this time, for sure.
Wow. It's such a marvelous poem. Do you remember the seeds of that, about what first sparked that and maybe brought you elsewhere?
In this case, I do not. But I feel absolutely certain that it began simply with the moon, just the idea of the moon. And I remember hearing Toni Morrison say, she was talking about the imagination, and she was talking about the overemphasis perhaps on innovation. And she said, look at the moon. What do you think you could say new about the moon? And yet we write about it over and over again and brush it off. And there it is, new and fresh again through the centuries. And so perhaps this began with that sense that we'll return to that ancient, eternal symbol of so many things, the moon, and see where that experience transports us. Follow the brush. And the brush took us to kind of the sense of the loss of the moon. At the time, I think I was also studying a lot and teaching about the ancients, the ancient gods, the ancient writing, the classics, philosophy, and so there's I invite, or I didn't invite, perhaps they found their way into this poem, and a sense of circus as well in this.
Yeah. It seems the way that it's impacted you since then. I appreciate you sharing those ripples about how it's continued to take shape in different forms along the way. Dave, this has been such a remarkable and fun time for me to get the chance to talk with you about your work.
Oh, and for me too.
I always like to close by asking to make sure we stay embodied and elemental. I like to ask the guest, if you were going to pair our conversation with a drink, anything from water to whiskey, what would you pair it with and why?
Oh, I think we're going to have to raise a Guinness to this one, a glass of Guinness. I'm deeply rooted in Irish culture, some ancestry, and traveling there a lot and appreciating their appreciation for poetry, for song, for music, shared values there. And so, of course, the drink that symbolizes much of Ireland is a mug of Guinness. So let us raise that. Cheers.
I love it. I love it. Cheers. Yeah, sláinte. May we someday clink glasses of Guinness. That would be fantastic.
Yes.
Thank you for listening to Contemplify. May it refresh you and be a contemplative refuge. And perhaps, maybe a moment or two will walk with you along the rest of your day. You can slide over to contemplify.com to find the show notes for this episode, including links to the resources mentioned in this conversation. And while you're there, you can also sign up for the monthly Contemplify non-required reading list, which I tee up with a contemplative musing, then reflect on a few books that have come across my desk, and wink at the art and articles stilling my soul. If you're enjoying Contemplify, please rate and review it on your podcast player. The internet's a huge place. This helps spread the contemplative cheer. The theme song for Contemplify is called Langside by Charles Enns and Darren Hovius. Fellas, thanks as always. For Season 4 of Contemplify, I want to offer a nod. This is not an ad, but a nod of appreciation. This nod goes out to the Center for Spiritual Imagination. The Center for Spiritual Imagination exists to deepen and enrich human relationships with God, self, and neighbor in new and ancient ways. I can say with certainty that some of you listening, the offerings from the Center for Spiritual Imagination are exactly what you have been longing for. Check it out at spiritualimagination.org. And as always, I'm looking forward to bringing you more musings and more conversations with contemplatives in the world here in the near future. Until then, be well.